Matt Golden. And the webinar today, as you know, is to bring everyone up to date on where we are with the Energy Upgrade California software strategy. So we're going to start here, slide 2. The slide 2 shows the flow for today's presentation. We're going to start with the introduction, providing some context for the project. Then we're going to move through phase 1, phase 2, finally the conclusion, and then some questions. We're going to ask you to submit your questions by raising your hand and typing them in. If we get time at the very end, after having answered those questions, then we may unmute you one at a time and take questions verbally. Moving to slide 3. So in the 1205-015 decision, page 195, the Public Utility Commission directed, the ALJ directed the Commission staff and the IOUs to work collaboratively on with the California Energy Commission and other Energy Upgrade California stakeholders to identify approaches to adequately, quote, broaden allowable software under Energy Upgrade California while containing costs for required or needed Commission staff reviews. So PG&E, on behalf of the investor-owned utilities, approached the PUC last summer and proposed what we were going to do to meet that requirement. They accepted that, and we subsequently hired Matt Golden as a contractor to help us with this process. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt from here, and we'll move on from slide 4. Matt?
Great. Thank you, Leif. We'll go ahead and move to slide 4. And just for everyone's amusement, we have a little technology problem, so as we're advancing, I'm going to be calling out the slide names to make sure we're all on the same page here. But I do appreciate everybody getting on the call today. And our goal today is really to go through this project to date, get everyone up to speed on where we are, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the next steps moving forward in terms of how this project will go, and ultimately, at a high level, set some expectations about how this may, at least to work to date, with the information we have to date, how this is going to impact the program, or at least give you again, where we are currently. So the first phase of this project really involved a wide-ranging stakeholder needs assessment, as well as research into current best practices and technologies around the country to address this issue of how to broaden software offerings in the California market. So what we're going to go through in this next section of this PowerPoint actually is to talk through some of the findings and results from the outreach that we did to, again, a pretty wide range of stakeholders, and we'll kind of go through each and talk a little bit about what we heard and what some of the themes were that emerged, as well as discussing a little bit really where the current state of affairs is currently related to energy efficiency software in the residential marketplace and kind of what our options actually are. And then we have actually reached some agreement to date in terms of the output of that first step in the process that we're going to outline from the investor-owned utilities in California, and also with agreement from the Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission as to a way forward. And so the next phase in the project, which again we are moving into over the next few months, is phase 2, which makes sense, which is a technical evaluation and design phase of this project. So basically building on the stakeholder discussions that we've had and the analysis of what the opportunities and also the barriers are currently, we again have kind of a straw person proposal as how to move forward, and the next phase will be pulling together kind of the technical acumen as well as the stakeholder process to really actively take the output from phase 1 and turn it into something that's operationalized that we can actually deploy in short order to improve the Energy Upgrade California program for hopefully all stakeholders involved. Next slide. So this is just obviously a placeholder. We'll just keep moving, but we're going to, in this next section of the presentation today, go kind of stakeholder by stakeholder, talking about the input that we received and as well as some of the findings. Next slide. We're on 6. Just to give you give everybody an idea of kind of the overarching kind of agenda that we had when we were talking to each stakeholder, really was pretty open process, wanted to hear feedback from each stakeholder about how the current software offering kind of, and contextualized within the program was affecting their kind of different orientations on the program, different interests, and hear feedback as to any ideas in terms of how that could be improved, barriers it was causing, and really understand both the scope of the problem and what ideas existed out there in terms of potential remedies, as well as addressing some of the kind of, there are some specific technical challenges around data and the likes, and so we heard kind of relatively consistent feedback from all quarters, but we'll go through kind of each. So let's move to the next slide, which is slide 7. So again, we're going to go through a series of these. We're going to start with the contractor's perspective from outreach that we did to a really broad base of home performance contractors. Included in this also is firms that do ratings, as well as some of the organizations like CalSearch and Efficiency First California, formerly CPUC, who also have kind of a representative interest. And I would say there have been additional, in addition to this list of stakeholders, there have been quite a number of conversations as well in this process, which has been going on for really at this point about, I would say, there was a concerted effort for about 2 or 2.5 months, but really has continued up until this current time, briefing different stakeholders. So talking to contractors, we heard a number of themes that were actually reflected amongst many of the different stakeholders that we talked to, that the current model where they're basically being required to use one specific piece of software for energy modeling is creating barriers, that their priority is focus on simplicity and ease of use and kind of reducing burdens on the business model, making sure that the tools that they have actually, don't just do the energy component necessary for the regulatory side of this program, but also assist in business functions, in particular reporting out results and improving sales ability to get adoption to happen. There's also an awareness that we have accuracy issues with this current software, and I would say that that is a looming issue. It's not something necessarily that's holding folks up currently, though a lot of folks we heard from actually discounting the output of the software in terms of talking to customers and setting expectations that were potentially lower, or discounting the output of the tool, which is probably not an ideal scenario when we're trying to build demand. And then they're doing that because there's a lack of confidence in the current accuracy. And then ultimately streamlining this process to reduce not just the consumer end, but also reduce friction within the program and really overhead costs that the program is incurring, and hoping anyways that software can be actually something that benefits and reduces those costs. So some of the overarching comments we heard is a hope that there can be more of a marketplace and more competition and choice ultimately for companies to determine what piece of software and ultimately kind of the business model that they choose to go into based on their customers and what works for them. So there's really a strong desire to see more opportunities to kind of create competition in the marketplace and allow companies to ultimately choose those tools that work best for them. And again, really looking to software not just as a reporting function, but hoping that it can actually be something that improves their business models and reduces overhead and costs. So recommendations had to do a lot with creating more of a marketplace and allowing much more choice in terms of the tools that are available to them in their business, and ultimately integrating those tools and hopefully helping reduce overhead costs that are kind of inherent in the program. Next slide. So the next slide it has to do with conversations that we had with program implementers. And we again heard a lot of consistent themes, and we're going to find that there's a lot of consistency between all these different stakeholder groups. So I'm going to do my best not to just repeat myself over and over again. But the good news is actually that there's a lot of consistency between all these different stakeholders, though generally from a slightly different orientation. So I may not speak to every single bullet on every page, which I think is to everyone's benefit, but you'll start to recognize some of these bullets as they're often repeated. But obviously the program implementers, maybe not obviously, but they're really tied to the success ultimately of this program and the contractors within it. So we heard really a strong desire to reduce the burden on contractors, and that's really a function of reducing burden on contractors, resulting in more contractors entering the program, which is obviously key for us to scale up. We also heard that there is a growing awareness again of this accuracy issue with the software. So we need to both allow more tools into the market, but also do something ultimately to improve accuracy in the program. And those potentially can be mutually exclusive, and so that's one of the overarching themes that we're looking at, is how to allow software in while also improving accuracy. There's an awareness, especially from a program implementer standpoint, of dealing with multiple pieces of software that might have multiple, unfortunately may have considerably different outputs in terms of percentage improvements, and that's unfortunate. It's also good, because that could mean we have more accuracy, but fundamentally it's going to increase complexity. So how do we make it so that models have at least very similar, or at least relatively similar results, so that we don't get a race to the bottom where folks are basically being incentivized to use the software that's the least accurate because it drives the biggest incentive. We also have, obviously, issues with program implementers who have been currently doing most of the software training and support, having to support multiple different tools in the marketplace. There's also, on the program implementer side, they're dealing with programmatic data, so making sure that data that's coming from different software tools in the market are able to be integrated with the program software, so that we're not creating many new redundant steps. And one thing that comes up consistently through these conversations is home performance XML, often called as HP XML, which is something it's actually in testing right now in New York and a few other markets, and essentially it's a dictionary, is the best way to describe it, that enables different tools to communicate with each other and transfer data back and forth. That's something that is on the horizon and is being integrated and implemented kind of across the board. It may not be something that we're able to launch with in the next few months, or maybe this calendar year, but it's definitely on the horizon as a way to manage the data complexity. So some of the major concerns, they're very much in support of better tools for the contractor. Anything to actually help build industry capacity is a benefit. And I heard, from a couple of different sources, but essentially at the moment, this idea of successful modeling is currently viewed as maximizing rebate potential, as being kind of the market reality that we're in. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but also that is definitely not in line with the idea of trying to reduce variance or improve accuracy, when that is the ultimate goal right now. So in general, there's a strong support of moving towards allowing different tools into the market, but some of the core recommendations have to do with data standards, and ultimately, for program implementers, as we start seeing additional tools entering the market, it's probably not going to be a reasonable role to expect program implementers to support every tool from a training standpoint that's in the market. So needing to start shifting some of that training and support from the program implementer to the software provider. It's just is a realistic outcome. So let's move to the next slide. So talking to the software companies themselves, who both Energy Pro 5, who's in this market, as well as a variety of tools that are building software solutions for home performance and energy efficiency companies in general. I would say that's the broad definition of home performance, and there are quite a number that we spoke with that were interested in bringing their tools to the software market in California. And ultimately, it's a broad range. If you think of the spectrum of software, we've been working with physics simulation models, which is kind of on one edge of the spectrum, but the tools that we're looking at here that could potentially participate in the California market really span quite a range of different approaches, from tools that are more based on regression and data and less on physics, and some that kind of are creating a hybrid of that. But there's a wide range of approaches and tools that provide very different experiences for contractors and consumers. But the overarching concern that makes it difficult just to open the floodgates is our kind of lack of ability to really gauge accuracy. And then, of course, if we let multiple tools into the marketplace, how do we make sure that we're getting consistent, or at least relatively consistent results? So again, that we don't have the situation where whatever tool overpredicts the most becomes the most lucrative to use. And that's an unintended consequence we want to avoid. So the top priorities from the software company standpoint is getting access to the California market. They understand that this market is not huge currently, but we have a long-term run on the Energy Upgrade California program with these latest rulings coming out of the PUC, and they see the scale and the size of California, and I think there's a lot of companies that are interested in investing and bringing kind of best tools to the market. And other parties involved, obviously they are aware of the complexity of the California environment, so making sure there are consistent, clear rules and kind of managing the regulatory complexity that comes with California as well for these companies. So the comments and concerns, again, there's a lot of folks that really want to be here, and that's good news if we're trying to bring new options to the California market that will work better. There is this concern that there are so many different players in this space and things that are potentially creating uncertainty, like the AB 758 and other processes that are underway, that could change the rules over time, and that's something that makes this environment a little less opportune from an investment standpoint. There's definitely a number of folks who have expressed issues, and I'll get into a little more detail on this, and with the HERS best test process, which is, and there will be a whole section that we address the kind of different testing opportunities out there, but best test does not fit all software models. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And ultimately, there is a move and a lot of support for the general idea to start to create more accountability to actual savings as a way to kind of start keeping score in the marketplace. One additional point that I think is interesting is that in talking to these different companies, I think virtually every one of them, if not every one of them, is currently involved with or considering or starting to integrate with HPXML. So while it's not out in a final version, and it is something that is being worked on diligently, and that we're hearing kind of on all sides that there is a standardization occurring. So we may need to do some things in the short term, which may not be quite as slick as having agreed to XML protocol, but there's a really pretty clear move towards HPXML in the short run that can really help integrate these different tools together. And so one of the recommendations, again, is circle around HPXML because it is being integrated by these different providers, and to the degree that's possible, leverage existing standards so we're not creating new barriers and new costs into the California market. We do need to balance, whatever programmatic costs and requirements we create with the fact that we really also want to encourage these folks to come to town and to test their tools and see if it can have a positive impact on the program. Wanted to advance to slide 10, technical outreach, and this is a little more broad. This is just a wide range of conversations we've had with different players in this market that have been working on different initiatives around software accuracy, kind of a wide range of approaches and that are going on, and very supportive of kind of some of the issues, and we're hearing a lot of the same issues we're having in California being reflected around the country. So we may be a microcosm, but fundamentally the same hurdles that exist in California tend to exist basically everywhere at this point. So there's a wide agreement from these technical sources that something needs to be done to improve and kind of create more of a marketplace for software and predictive software in particular for contractors. And I think we're going to get a little bit more into the technical a little later on, so I'm not going to kind of go through what those are at this point, but did get quite a bit of feedback on some of the issues we're dealing with and the potential outcomes that we've come up with that we'll talk to near the end and how those can fit in. Again, I'll address this more when we actually start talking about some of those technical potential opportunities. So let's move to the next slide, the CPUC Outreach. So again, this project was really at the direction of the administrative law judge ruling that occurred through the Public Utilities Commission, so we've been very tightly organized, or coordinated anyways, with the folks at the CPUC. And really it's been the IOUs working together as a vehicle to kind of create this change that they've ruled needed to have happened. So they're very interested, obviously, from a California long-term energy efficiency strategic plan standpoint of seeing this market grow rapidly. We have very large goals in residential energy efficiency, and it's going to take some different and I think more aggressive thinking to scale up to a place where we can reasonably start to see ourselves hitting those numbers. So there was, in general, a lot of support that we figure out a way to allow more diversity, to make this more palatable to contractors in terms of that particular framework. There's also a growing awareness of some of the accuracy challenges and clearly that relationship between the Public Utilities Commission and the utilities in terms of how much savings is actually being delivered to the Home Performance and Energy Upgrade California program is an increasing concern as we get more data on that front. And so I think it's that, again, this very difficult to figure out combination of increasing the amount of software options in the marketplace while simultaneously improving performance. And we do have some ideas around that we'll get to, but that's kind of the overarching concern for the Public Utilities Commission. Moving on to slide 12, the California Energy Commission. This is a long-term conversation that we've been having, and it's been in the context of AB 758, HERS 2, and other efforts that the Energy Commission are undertaking as well. They've been obviously very tightly integrated with Energy Pro 5 and in the past. And we are talking to them, and they are supporting a move towards a more open system at this point, though we have yet to reach final approval on what that will exactly look like. But there does seem to be consensus growing that the needs of the Energy Upgrade California program are different than some of the needs around labeling and some of the requirements around HERS 2 and code. And we may, in fact, need to have some solutions that are different between those two markets. And that doesn't have to be a value statement or one market versus the other, but that there are fundamental differences between these different use cases, essentially. So there were some concerns, and I would say more questions at this point about where, if we were gathering data and starting to use more tools, how we actually manage that in the marketplace, how we ensure that these tools work for all the different types of measures that can be implemented in all the different kind of climate zones that are in California, and ultimately where that data lives and who's actually in charge of ensuring that the software solution works broadly. And they're very focused, obviously, as well, I mean, not obviously, but on getting better data on how the programs are actually performing, and I think that's something that's widely understood as a need, is to have more clarity into what's actually happening in the marketplace so we can make better programmatic decisions. They've been looking at calibration as a potential solution to some of our accuracy problems, and there's a question of whether or not some sort of calibration requirement becomes part of this process, or if that calibration is more of a tactic that folks will use to achieve better results. Ultimately, how do we manage the risk associated with letting a lot of different tools in the marketplace, and concerns about people, for example, scraping kind of low-hanging fruit and not necessarily going as deep as we need to. And again, there's this potential that we have to overcome, and we'll speak about that, about a race to the bottom, where we let in lots of tools, and the one that overpredicts the most throws out the biggest rebates and has a competitive advantage, which is not the scenario that we're looking for. In fact, it's the exact opposite of what we're looking for. So next slide. In terms of the investor-owned utilities, again, this project right now is being spearheaded by PG&E, but it's in cooperation with the 4 California IOUs. And again, very similar concerns. The investor-owned utilities have some regulatory requirements and a desire to see Energy Upgrade California reach many more homeowners than we currently are achieving. So that ties in, obviously, with making this whole system work better for both contractors and homeowners, and that has to do with reducing barriers for companies to enter the market and be profitable doing so, but also ensure that the results we're giving consumers are accurate to the degree that we're not making promises that we're not fulfilling broadly. Some of from the investor-owned utility standpoint, there's also looking through the lens of whatever types of systems we actually come to implement, making sure that there's a clear strategy and a plan of how you operationalize these ideas, because ultimately somebody's going to have to actually implement whatever we come up with. So there's a lot of focus really on kind of the brass tacks of how you actually implement any idea that we come out with, and make sure that there's not too much overhead associated with it for the program. But ultimately, the utilities are being held accountable to the savings that we're predicting and the rebates that are being generated. So this accuracy issue that we keep referring to is particularly acute for the investor-owned utilities, who are essentially getting paid based on whether or not the savings are being delivered to the end customer. So with that, I think we're going to move on to slide 14. Those are kind of the key stakeholder groups that we spoke with. Again, I think we got a very representative sample of the stakeholders. I think we're across the board probably 25 or 30% more folks that we spoke with in each category, but they'll give you a range of who was actually included, kind of the more organized part of this outreach process. So in summary, there was a lot of kind of broad agreements. I talked through each category, but if you're following along, I was saying many of the very similar things, often from slightly different perspectives, but fundamentally the same major issues. So there's a broad agreement that we need to make some serious changes to the software environment in the Energy Upgrade California program. That we're also, as we spoke through the options of how one does that, there's kind of a great deal of limitation in the existing software testing solutions that are in the market. And there'll be a slide in a moment where we'll go into what that kind of looks like. But there doesn't seem to be a go-to strategy built directly upon any previous work that solves for some of the major problems that we'll speak about directly, without creating potentially unintended consequences. There's a feeling that we need to encourage innovation, so there's this balance of standardization with innovation, and making sure that we can allow innovative market solutions into the marketplace, and just a real urgency to make changes in the EUC and make sure it becomes successful quickly. We don't have a lot of time to kind of keep going in the direction that we're going. And ultimately, that participating in energy upgrade California needs to get easier and more profitable, and that includes easier for consumers and easier and more profitable for businesses from a scale up. Next slide, in terms of recommendations. These are kind of overarching recommendations or goals that emerge from this process, and this is, I think, a filter that I've been thinking through, and many of us at PG&E and others have been thinking about. The goal ultimately from the PUC is to broaden allowable software, and that remains kind of the overarching goal. But in order to do that successfully, I think we have to address these additional bullet points. So again, we want to allow diversity of software predictive tools into the market. That's an overarching goal. But to do that, we need to improve accuracy of predictions. So the accuracy that we're achieving right now from the limited studies that we have, but there seems to be that we are not as accurate as we probably need to be or could be in the marketplace. And so when we talk about accuracy, and we'll be using these words, and I'll explain them a little better in a moment, but that's in terms of realization rate and variance. And realization rate is essentially how right are you on average. And as a portfolio, if we predict 20% savings on average, what's the outcome of those savings? Are we delivering 22% savings, or are we delivering 18% savings? And that's often expressed in the portfolio basis as realization rate. And then variance, you can be right on average and still have a large number of winners and losers in the pool. And I think the statistician joke that I've heard a number of times, there's really two of them. One is the statistician that drowned in a river that's an average of 6 inches deep. I know you're all on mute, but I'm sure you're laughing. And then the other one is statisticians that went hunting, and the first one shot and missed 5 feet to the right, and the next one shot and missed 5 feet to the left, and the third one said, "We got him!" And of course, nobody actually got them. Anyway, you can all have a good chuckle. Those are my only 2 statistician jokes I know, actually. But so obviously, we can't win by being massively wrong and average, or being right on average necessarily either. We need to address both of these points. The next one is normalizing model predictions, and this again, as we spoke to multiple times, but we need, if we're going to allow, let's say, potentially 3 or 4 choices into the California marketplace, we need to make sure there's not wide variance. We don't have some tools massively over-predicting and others maybe being accurate, and again, setting up a situation where picking the tool that does maybe a more accurate job is actually something that hurts your business and makes compared to your competitors who are using another tool that is less accurate but is ultimately driving larger incentives. And then, of course, the standards, so making sure that if we have multiple tools in the marketplace, that we have standards for data and security, and also consumer reporting. We'll talk a little bit about that. I think what we're talking about is just making sure consumers get accurate and kind of the same data set out of each of these tools, not necessarily the same report. So we move on to the next slide. We're going to jump into phase 2, and so this is a proposed technical direction. We're going to talk about what's out there a little bit and what the options are, and then dive into a little bit of what the actual next steps are in terms of which of those options, which direction are we moving to this technical phase of actually vetting a process that we can actually deploy and let more software into the marketplace. So next slide, number 17. So I actually probably should have held on this, giving this explanation 4 slides ago, but really most importantly wanted to talk about the fact that regardless of the piece of software or the approach, and this is really a broad range, this is the common denominator in energy efficiency is basically, regardless of whether you're using a deemed savings value for a furnace, some sort of pick from a list system that might give you some percentage savings, or any number of software models that range from simulation models on one side to various regression tools that are essentially using lookup tools, tables of actual data. There's a wide range of approaches to making predictions, but fundamental to all of these different approaches is that there's ultimately an underlying prediction of what's going to happen from a certain set of actions, and we have actual bills. And you weather normalize those bills, and what you get is essentially a realization rate and a variance level. And there's a lot of concern on things like behavior obviously affects that, so does, and we'll talk a little bit more, there's many factors, but ultimately, from a resource standpoint, when we're bringing an energy efficiency resource to market, that delta, that difference between prediction versus actual is ultimately the product that we're bringing to market. That's the savings. That actually is a potential grid resource. That's a reduction in carbon. That's all of these. That's a reduction of bills to our consumers. That's the net resource. And so again, this is really about 2 things. The portfolio average, and by the way, this graph I'm showing here has nothing to do with Energy for California. It's just a scatter plot. It's a theoretical scatter plot. But there's the realization rate, which we obviously care about, and it's ultimately what the utilities are graded on with the Public Utilities Commission, which says, if we said we're going to deliver X amount of savings, what did we do that, right, as a portfolio, on average? And then there's variance level. And variance level matters to, quite frankly, the utilities also, because every one of these dots on this graph, not that this is a real graph, but every dot on the graph is a real live customer. And this absolutely matters for contractors who are dealing with individual customers. And quite frankly, if you go to a customer and say they're going to save 40% and they save 20%, they're not really comforted by the fact that other people may have gone maybe on the other side of that equation. And so just the fact that you're right on average doesn't really help the people on the bottom side of this graph that maybe didn't see the savings that were projected and that they thought they were buying. So it matters to us to be right on average from kind of a resource portfolio standpoint, but from the individual consumer standpoint, those variance levels really matter as well. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So how do we do this? How do we let more software? It sounds like such an easy problem. It's not quite as easy as it sounds. So I'm not going to go into excruciating detail, but these are some of the solutions that either exist or may exist in the marketplace. So Best Test is kind of the most well-known solution. Quite frankly, it's the Best Test and then the ResNet software testing suite for existing homes, kind of a mouthful. So let me start with Best Test is a software simulation test that essentially tests simulation software against other simulation software to see how it performs. And it works for physics models and really intrinsic in the test. It's called a stress test. So it's stressing the physics in the model, so it only works really on physics models. But the Best Test by itself only really looks at building shell, so heating and cooling loads, and doesn't factor into things like dust loss or HVAC equipment and the likes, or hot water usage, for example. So ResNet has basically wrapped that Best Test in a series of other tests that also look for things like can you predict domestic hot water usage within a certain range, et cetera. These tests are all, again, and so those are existing, and there are software packages that have been approved and passed this basic testing formula. And Energy Pro 5, for example, I don't think it's passed its most recent version, but it has passed it previously, as of other tools in the market. The downside of this test is that there are a number of tools that just don't pass a simulation stress test because they're not simulation models. And ultimately, I don't think we have the data, but the data that we do have shows that those tools should be taken seriously. And the fact that they're not purebred physics models may not be something, we may not want to exclude them. So there's some issues there. And also these tests tend to screen out tools that are significantly deviate from reality, don't have robust algorithms and the likes, but they don't really screen for high quality either. So they're okay as a screening test, but will they accomplish better results over time or software that's more accurate? I think the data would say that they don't, because we can see markets where these tests are being employed. And again, they do screen out complete junk basically, but they don't necessarily screen for good. Best Test EX was an attempt to do a best test for existing homes. I'm putting it up here not just because it's talked about quite a bit, but it's not real. It was never kind of kicked out the door, so it's not really available to us. There is an effort by NREL right now to develop something called an empirical data software test, which essentially takes real data from real houses and says, here's some real data, tell us how this house ought to perform, and then compare that to real data. And ultimately, I think this will be an improvement over Best Test. I'm not sure that it necessarily also solves for that long-term accuracy issue either. However, it's also not ready, so it's not something we can leverage currently. And then real-time performance, and it's something that we're going to talk about. We're really actually, in this presentation, talking to we're calling it the empirical approach, and that's kind of a hybrid of using some of these tools that were listed above as a way to screen software on the way in, but then creating a model that uses actual performance over time to provide feedback and calibration to the system to encourage improvement ultimately over time. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, number 19, please. So as I said, we looked at the existing tools like Best Test and the like and determined that they solved for part of the equation. They gave us some confidence that a tool was good enough to come into the program, but they didn't help with the normalization issue for these tools. There's still going to be wide variance with tools that pass Best Test. And there's also, again, tools that we think are likely maybe as good or better than some of these tools that just simply won't pass Best Test, which is a problem. But ultimately, it won't normalize between tools, and it doesn't drive a motivation to improve over time and see better accuracy. So we've been working on an approach that, kind of, for lack of a more markety term, we're calling the empirical approach, which essentially we're saying we're going to use actual performance data, which you might know as utility bills, to basically true up predictions to ensure consistency across models in the marketplace. So one of the key factors here is to create accountability and visibility between predictions and actual delivered savings. And so that right now in this program, we're asking folks to be accurate and do modeling, but we're not even providing basic feedback as to what is going on with these predictions. Are they accurate? Are they not accurate? And quite frankly, our interests are not directly in line with that. So nobody is being held accountable to those results. So quite frankly, right now, fundamentally, driving more accurate predictions, and this is, I'm going to use broad generalization, so there's an argument that this may not be true in the long run, which I may subscribe to, but for sure in the short run, when you consider where our incentives lie, making more accurate predictions will essentially, given some of the data that we have, likely drive smaller incentives to your customers, which will result in smaller rebates and lower sales. So ultimately, unfortunately, we're not in a scenario, and this also ties back to that comment that some of the program implementers said, which is that ultimately the goal right now is to maximize incentives through a piece of software as kind of the modeling goal. Our incentives aren't aligned. There's no real benefit directly except for maybe the long-term happy customer benefit, which may be real, but the short-term incentives are all aligned with driving the largest predicted savings that you can get away with, essentially. So we really need to change that fundamental model, because I'm a believer that ultimately in a capitalist system, folks will do what you pay them for. So what we're hoping, and then the system that we're essentially looking at moving forward with in the empirical approach, is to essentially use past realization rates and variance levels to calibrate future incentives. So essentially, if you're overestimating, you being at the piece of a software tool has a history of overestimating savings, we're going to basically use that past performance to calibrate future results. And key to this system, especially in the short term, is to be designed in a way that is non-punitive. We're not going to take, is not to try to take away incentives from consumers or quote-unquote make contractors pay. We haven't even provided basic feedback. So the goal is to have this really use past performance to influence the future, basically the future predictions that are driving incentives, and start to create that feedback loop and accountability, but to do so carefully in a way that we're not asking folks to basically take on risk that at the moment is not really risk. It's really uncertainty until we start to build this data set and provide the feedback so folks can understand, how are they really performing in the marketplace. And so ultimately, this is all about aligning incentives with our ultimate goal, which is energy savings that can actually be delivered and measured. And fundamentally, I'm a big believer that that's the most important and kind of the root cause of some of our accuracy issues in the marketplace, is that we're ultimately the way our incentives in the system is set up right now, we're really not set up to encourage the kind of results that we want to see. Next slide, 20. So when we talk about aligning incentives, there's this question like, why do we overestimate savings? And I'm going to use, again, broad generalization, so this is a conversation, but there's lots of issues, right? There are good arguments and reasons why many of the tools in the market have a propensity just built into them to over-predict based on, not really able to incorporate real behavior, like temperate climate zones, and there's all sorts of algorithmic reasons, but is it really a software problem? That's a good question. And some of the data that I've seen from other markets shows that even if there's an overestimation that's occurring overall, there still are contractors that are, on average, delivering on their savings, which implies that it's at least not entirely a software question. Could it be training? Do people know how to use these models? And that's, or are people implementing the measures that they're being called out correctly so that they actually work? And that all ties into it as well. Consumer behavior also ties into it. Do customers say, wow, my house is so comfortable, I'm going to set my thermostat to 72 year-round and see their bills go up? That's probably real too. But fundamentally, in my opinion, it's this misalignment of incentives that overarches the entire thing and actually makes it so that we're not calibrating and fixing some of these underlying issues. Fundamentally, contractors are being incentivized to maximize predictions and ultimately meet the minimum requirement of the program that they can get away with. And again, this is not individual, and this is on an individual basis, but this is as a system. If you predict large incentives and you can get away with 4 hours of air sealing when you really should have done 8, you're going to close more jobs and make more money, and that's just a truth. And unfortunately, what's happening is that I think a lot of contractors in this market, many of whom I know, are not doing that, and they're paying dearly for it because the marketplace is not rewarding their efforts, ultimately. So all of these things like software and training and consumer behavior, they're all baked in when we talk about that common denominator between prediction and actuals. If you think about energy efficiency as a resource that we're delivering to a marketplace, You don't get to sell the fruit that went bad in your truck on the way to the market. So all of these things get baked in. But I believe that the fundamental overarching solution to this problem is to set up a system that really keeps score at a basic level and makes it more profitable to do high-quality work and deliver on savings than to over-predict and under-deliver. And it's that change in incentive that will ultimately drive the changes in these other parts of the value stream that go much farther than software. Next slide. So the question is there a right answer? And I think this is an interesting question as well. So, in a world where we have many types of consumers, families with kids in uncomfortable bedrooms with money in the bank are fundamentally different than people whose furnaces go out on a Friday night. And we also have many types of businesses. HVAC companies and home performance companies and installation companies and raters and auditors, these aren't the same business models fundamentally. So is there a single right answer in terms of software and business model? I have my personal perspective, and I think that there are likely many winners. And quite frankly, if we keep score, some losers as well, but it's really about results. And it's about actually measuring what the outcome is. So in terms of business and software models, we need to be in a position where they're able to evolve and that they get actual market feedback and market forces affecting that evolution. And we will see, I believe, if we keep score and start to calibrate the value of these predictions to what's actually being delivered ultimately to the consumer, and what is the thing that ultimately gets PG&E paid and everybody else, which are the real savings, the right answers will emerge. And again, this is not about saying ultimately getting to as accurate as possible is the goal. It's really finding that balance between cost and accuracy and the value of the savings. Next slide. So the ultimate goals of this basic approach that go beyond obviously allowing more software into the market, which is the overarching goal, is to reward contractors for being accurate in their predictions, inform software developers how well their software does in the field, actually provide some real data and feedback, and create a level playing field that encourages innovations. So, if we create a common judge and a common scorekeeping system, we can encourage companies on all parts of the spectrum to innovate, to build better software, to train their crews better, to provide feedback to customers so they use their houses more effectively. Ultimately, so that we can see different business models and software tools emerge that work for consumers and contractors and drive the kind of savings that ultimately are valuable to the utility sector. So we're going to move on to the conclusion, and then get to your questions. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Leif Magnuson, who will kind of go through the next what are the next steps, and then we'll look forward to getting to as many questions as we can.
Yeah. So very briefly, just to conclude, then we've completed phase one. We completed the stakeholder needs assessment, and we have vetted the proposed empirical approach with the PUC, the CEC, and the IOUs, and they've approved this approach for the next steps. And phase two is underway with technical investigation of software acceptance protocols and tests currently in the market or under development. Matt, did you want to talk about this convening tech work group?
Sure, and to just make sure we're on slide 25. Certainly. So we are going to be convening, and we'll talk about how, if you're interested, you can express that interest. But we're going to be convening kind of two working groups in this next phase. A very small technical working group, and not meant to be small to be exclusive, but folks that actually can devote serious time to this effort to solve some of these really kind of foundational technical problems. And we'll be having very regular meetings, probably weekly, to work through kind of a long list of, as we discuss this with technical resources and whatnot. We have a pretty good list of things that we have to kind of work through before we can operationalize this process. And then we're also going to be convening a stakeholder working group, where this is going to be a larger group, though we hope to contain it within a very kind of a reasonable number of folks, but ensuring that we have kind of representation from each of the stakeholder groups that we talked to earlier in the slide. And this is not the same kind of broad stakeholder group that many of you may be involved in through the PUC in this phone call. This is also a group that will be meeting on a regular basis, and it's really the sounding board, as a technical group works through these technical problems and comes up with actual straw proposals, bringing that to this stakeholder group to get feedback. So that we're not just waiting to the very end and kind of launching it on everybody. And we'll be working, and if folks are interested in that, in that being part of that group. And Leif, you might want to move to the next slide, 26. This is Leif's contact information.
Yeah, and actually I just want to make a slight correction to this slide. If you're interested in being a member of the stakeholder working group, I actually want to encourage you to get on the service list for this proceeding rather than contacting me. We're not going to keep a separate list. It'll all be off the PUC service list. So with that, we're going to move to questions. We apologize here because we're a little limited. We weren't able to log on from where we are, so we haven't been able to see your questions so far. So I'm going to ask Tracy to read Matt and I the questions, beginning with the first one that we have. And Tracy, could you give us a sense of how many questions we have?
So right now we have 3.
That sounds very manageable. And then once we get through these 3, we can open up to verbal questions if there are any.
Okay. So the first question is, will Empirical Approach provide an accuracy rate for companies?
So first of all, I can give you what I think what the current straw person thinking is to a degree, but ultimately we are moving into a technical process to kind of solve for exactly that sort of question. I think literally that question is on the list. I think that right now we will definitely be tracking accuracy at a company level, there's a discussion in terms of making sure again that especially at the beginning when we have never really provided feedback to individual companies as to how their performance is. I think at least my overarching goal is to make sure we're not being punitive, that we're providing the feedback, especially at the beginning, in a way that is supportive and helps folks improve, but won't be something that ends up on Yelp and is a big surprise to everybody. But we will definitely be tracking performance at a contractor level. Well, actually, definitely doesn't. Let me just reframe. I believe the consensus is likely that we will be doing that. That really, again, this next phase, and I'm going to have to be a little soft on these technical issues because there is kind of what we've been talking about, but ultimately the next phase in this process will be really about ironing out all of these answers in concrete form.
Yeah, I was going to add that as well. That clearly we do want to track on a contractor basis so that we can provide feedback to the contractor. What we do beyond that with that data would be a proposal that we would make to the stakeholder working group to get feedback on. Next question.
You had previously described how contractors adjusted expectations based on the modeling software to lower the expectations of the customers. In the later slide, you described how contractors are incentivized to use larger predictions while meeting minimum requirements. Can you explain this discrepancy?
Yeah, so I think that even in that context, I think it holds true. We had, I definitely won't name names, but again, I don't actually consider this be this. When we create a system that has certain incentives, I think folks doing what's fundamentally in their interest within that system is just capitalism, quite frankly. So I think what you see that contractors have an incentive and really no accountability to go other than to go in and look at a house and kind of maximize the percentage improvement to drive the largest incentive to that customer, and to do that within kind of what is reasonable within the program. And it may not be calibrated, it may not be what they know is the most conservative for that individual asset. However, when they're communicating to their customers, because they know that they have little confidence potentially in these predictions, let me put it that way, they're basically saying to them, hey, look, this is what we're giving the program, you got a 31% savings. But just so you know, we're not, just don't be aware that we're not confident that that's what you'll actually see, and we're much more conservative than that. And so that's my understanding is something like that is a pretty common way to take the results from the program and translate them to the customer.
Okay, next question is, what is the service list? How do you get on it? And what about the technical work group? How do you also get on that?
So we could probably, it might be that we want to send out a link to the PUC list service group because I don't know how to explain it over the telephone right now.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Yeah, it's if folks haven't been on these PUC groups, it's a little bit of, there's a few hurdles you have to cross through, but that will ensure that you're notified directly for any of these future webinars and the like. So we will continue to, I think, make sure that they're broadly advertised so folks will know, as we keep folks updated. So that's the kind of Public Utilities Commission services list, and we'll make sure that that information gets out. In terms of the technical working group, Leif, do you want to?
Yeah, so just two things there to add to what Matt said. So Tracy, question for you. You have record of all the people who've logged on and their emails?
Correct.
Okay, so that will be...
Build It Green will be, yes, Build It Green will be sending out a post email after the webinar with the link to the recorded webinar as well as the slides.
Okay, perfect. So so we'll just work off that list to let you know about how to get on the service list. And then as far as the technical working group, this at this point in time is comprised of technical experts in this area. I would say that if you have an interest in being on that work group, go ahead and contact me. I think I'd like to have a discussion with you about how much time you have available and your interest and sort of expertise for that work group, and we'll go from there. But we have how many folks do we have on that right now?
So we have a good strong, we have yet to, we're just moving into the phase 2, so we're just about to start to convene. So I think the goal is to, on the stakeholder work, to have a technical group of under 10 that's actually, like I said, that we have a pretty good start on, that are, again, this is really work, folks that are ultimately getting paid to actually help figure out the details on this stuff. And then this broader group, and we're trying to keep that broader group, under 20 just to keep it very manageable. And again, we're not, our goal there is just to make sure that we have broad representation, and it's not to preclude or this type of a more broad process. So if you're interested, you can reach out to Leif. If you have questions about these technical details, I'm happy to field emails or calls. I think my information is up on that slide as well. It's really not meant to be exclusionary, but we also want to keep it manageable. So we're trying to find that gray area.
And then last question so far is, will you be using variable-based temperature weather normalization to compute actual savings? If not, how will you adjust for the resulting inaccuracy?
Yeah, so the exact how is something that will come out but I think what you're talking, using weather station data to weather normalize, so is part of the straw person proposal. It's always been predictions versus weather normalized actuals has been kind of what we've been talking about as the common denominator. Again, we haven't quite technically described exactly what weather normalization looks like, but that will be happening in this next phase.
Will you be using variable-based, I just asked that question. Do you have enough utility data bills at this point to start to calibrate an empirical system?
Well, we have kind of a unique advantage that I'm sitting with Leif Magnuson, a PG&E employee at the PG&E offices. So we do have access to utility bill data as part of this process. Yeah, and I'm new here at PG&E, as many of you know, so I can't really speak to how easily accessible that data is. Clearly we have it, and it would be what we would draw on to provide some of that truing up of what was predicted and what actually occurred. So yes, I would, clearly that's our role in this, is to provide access to that data. How it gets safeguarded, if you will, certainly we're not going to divulge individual homes, but in aggregate, we can draw some conclusions based on that data. Yeah, let me just say that we haven't figured out the details, and there are some legal complexities, but there is an overarching desire and kind of a requirement that, especially if we create accountability, you have to create feedback. You can't just create accountability without feedback. So one of the goals is figuring out how we can accomplish that within kind of some of the rules and regulatory requirements around that data.
That's pretty much the questions as of right now.
Okay. Well, we have just a quick 2 minutes. If anybody has a burning question, maybe you could raise your hand and Tracy can unmute you if you'd like to ask it verbally, but if not, I just want to really express our appreciation for those who attended the call today. Tracy, how many people attended?
We had 36 people today.
Okay, great. So that's a real strong interest in this, and we encourage you to stay in touch with us as we go forward. Any burning questions?
Sounds good.
No, there isn't any.
Okay. All right, great. So we'll make sure that all of you are apprised through the service list of any future meetings. And until then, wish you all the best. Thank you for attending.